Howdy historians, how you doing? Welcome back from spring break. Hope you had a great staycation. I know I did. I'm actually recording this during spring break, but that's okay. Hi Joey. Oh, Joey just brought me his water in case you guys are wondering. I'm actually recording this one during spring break, but it's always good to be a little prepared and moving ahead. But I hope, honestly, that you did have a good time. Hopefully, you got some rest and things were a little bit easier and you didn't have to worry about school for a little bit, which is one really nice thing that you can typically do during spring break, a little bit of normalcy there. So, as we come back this week, like I had mentioned in our little intro video, we want to wrap up the Great Depression. That's going to take us about 2 days, and then we'll start to look at World War II and the causes thereof towards the end of the week. So what I'll start with this week is what it was like for Americans and like in America during the Great Depression. And this is something that gets typically a lot of attention when you study the Great Depression in any aspect, whether it's a class that you've already had in high school or a class that you're going to take later in college. What was it like for Americans who lived through this time? I talked a little bit about how it was for my grandparents during the Great Depression. Everybody has this story. Everybody has some of this depression mentality that came along with living through an event like this. Just like, let's be honest, we're living through an unprecedented time period in human history, not just American history, in human history right now. We'll be telling our kids and grandkids, your kids, your grandkids, about what it was like to live through the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, because it's going to change all of us. It will leave an impact on the way that our economy operates. It will leave an impact on the way that our society operates. They're talking about we should never shake hands again, right? There's going to be people who constantly keep rolls of toilet paper and paper towel and disinfectant wipes in their basement just in case. There's going to be people who stockpile some canned food in their basement just in case something like this happens again. It's the same thing with the Great Depression. People that lived through this were forever impacted by it in ways that we can describe, and honestly in some ways that we can't describe either. So there's lots going on here for America during the Depression. The Depression culture was something, again, that everybody lived through. One thing that people did have were movies. Movies were cheap. Lots of people were watching Gone with the Wind at this time. Lots of people were reading Grapes of Wrath at this time. People were starting to enjoy American folk tunes and listen to more music on the radio. And people were just trying to live their lives the best they could during this very difficult time period. One of the biggest things that impacted Americans during this time is losing your job. So unemployment was around 25% at the height of the Great Depression, and even going into World War II, unemployment was still around 10%, which is very high. So Americans were struggling with the identity of being able to provide for their families. At this time, it was still a very male-oriented economic world, and men were seen as the providers for the family. So when men lost their jobs, it was very difficult for them. This was not an uncommon picture to see men walking around with these kind of billboards where they would talk about who they were and some of their qualifications trying to find a job. And basically you had to do anything that you could to be able to make some money. So that way you could provide for your family and have that very centralized part of your identity. I am the breadwinner. I am able to provide for my family. But job security and finding jobs was very difficult. Because of that, you had to do lots of different things, right? You basically had to work in whatever industry you could find yourself in. So this is a photo of some men here eating in a soup kitchen that are migrant fruit pickers, migrant farm workers, basically. So these guys would move around. Primarily, they're going to be in the West and the Southwest, and they're going to try to find jobs on agricultural farms, so that way they can get some work, whether they're picking peas or picking fruit or picking corn, whatever they're going to do to be able to provide for their family. So they're going to go off and they're going to work. This is a typical kind of structure you saw during the Great Depression. Men would go out and get jobs, because that was the cultural norm at the time. And then women would stay at home to try to watch the family as best they could. And then the money that men would make would go to the family to be able to feed them. And then if there was anything left over, the men would eat, or they would go to the soup kitchen. Typically, you tried to keep your family out of the free food lines because you didn't want to put them through that shame and that disgrace, and you didn't want to put yourself through that shame and disgrace of having to watch your family, have a piece of bread, a roll, a cup of bad soup and a cup of coffee, right? You want your kids to be able to stay at home and have some normalcy in their life. So you see these men here. I always think it's interesting, a couple little things in this photo. One, this guy in the front is tan in an unhealthy way, and probably a little dirty too. When you look at his hands, they're very tough. You can tell a lot by someone's life by looking at their hands, how difficult their life has been or what type of work they've done. You can tell a lot by looking at a person's hands. And I like this guy down here on the end because he's so out of place. You can tell that this is a world that he was not ready for, and that, he was probably like a middle class professional, right? And all of a sudden he's thrust into this world. So you have to do whatever you can to try to eat and make life as normal as you can. And that's really difficult. One thing that happened at this time was a lot of people were homeless. A lot of people had to create these villages called Hoovervilles, is what they called them. A knock on President Hoover. So you would have these homes constructed of just whatever supplies you could find. They'd spring up in parks. They'd spring up in rural America, anywhere where people needed to live. And they called these Hoovervilles. And these were basically just little shanty homes that people made after they had been evicted or foreclosed. And this is where they lived. And you saw this all over the United States, right? It can be unsettling to witness homelessness, but when you see it on a scale like this, you can start to understand some of the impacts that it would have on the American psyche and start to understand just how crazy things were, right? That's why, right now during this pandemic, we're trying to prevent people getting kicked out of their homes and getting kicked out of their apartments, so that way all of a sudden you don't see this uptick and surge in homelessness, which would then cause all kinds of other social problems that would make the pandemic that we're facing even worse. And then imagine trying to make life as normal as possible in one of these little Hooverville shanty homes for your family, but that's what you were tasked to do. We'll talk about how that primarily fell into the lap of women during the next unit, but this, is just a little look inside. So you've got the family of 5, 1, 2, that kid you can already see, 3, 4, 5, all crowded around the table, and dad is there, carving up some food for everybody to try to share inside one of these little Hooverville shanty homes that they made. Hopefully mom just is off on the side doing something else. Hopefully mom is there, so that way dad doesn't have to shoulder all the burden. But unfortunately, there were a lot of families that did split at this time where someone just couldn't take it and would run off, or just not be present anymore. I like this picture because the show must go on in some ways. Here's a school during the Great Depression. So this is their furnace in the middle, right? There's not as many students there as there probably once were before, but you have to keep sending your kids to school as much as you can, so that way they can have an education, so that way whenever the economy rebounds, you're able to get out of this, right? We can tell this is post FDR because there's his election picture up in the corner, so he is now president, and this woman's just doing her best to try to give whatever lessons she can to these kids, so that way they're better off in the future. Also, look at these chairs they're sitting on, right? It's a log with a couple planks. They're kind of slick, right? This kid's leaning his back as he gets his feet up by the heater, but it's a whole different ball game, right? And then the picture, Little Red Riding Hood up there in the corner. So education must go on, right? Everyone's going to be impacted by this. Everyone's going to remember it. And then the life of for families at this time, it was just so difficult. This is Migrant Mother. If you haven't yet, I have this video on our topics page for the Great Depression. I have it linked here too. I'll just click on it so we can just see the very beginning of it. I absolutely... All right, let's get through this ad here real quick. I absolutely love this video. You can see I was just watching it, so it's queued up. This is about... All right, I'll let you check out the rest of that, so that way we can just kind of move forward with the lesson here. But seriously, check that out. It's short and it's so good, and it's about how this photo was made. It's the most famous photo from the Great Depression. You know, there's lots of them. That first one I showed you, those guys walking around with like the resumes on their chest, is a very famous one. This is a very famous one as well, from the title slide that actually I didn't have up when we started here. But check out the rest of that video. It's absolutely fantastic. It's absolutely amazing. So a little intro there for America during the Great Depression. But then when I focus on here for the rest of the time as you talk about America during the Depression, I want to talk about unions. If you're with the lecture outline, the bonus march, we already talked about that with Hoover's failed response. I'm going to talk about the rise of unions and then life for different groups in the United States during the Great Depression. So hop over to the next video. It's a relatively short one. We're going to talk about unions during the Great Depression, and then that'll wrap it up for today. And then next lesson, we'll look at life for specific groups during the Great Depression. Lesson after that. And we'll also wrap up the Great Depression. And then, end of the week, we'll start to look at World War II. So great job thus far. Flip over to the next video for unions during the Great Depression.